ESG is responsible investing. Who's responsible for building ESG into your investments? At PGIM, the pursuit is on for outperformance. As active investors to outdeliver with customized strategies, integrating ESG best practices into our investment decisions. As asset managers and fiduciaries to outserve with our commitment to better ESG outcomes. Join the pursuit of outperformance at PGIM, the investment management business of Prudential.
And many thanks to Chris and his panelists. Some great advice and guidance for solving the many practical problems around integrating ESG data. Now, let's move on to our next session, game-changing political risks in a post-pandemic world. And I'm delighted to welcome back our moderator, Jacina Kamerling, Head of Regulatory Outreach, EMEA at CFA Institute. And it can't have escaped most of you that the top story globally on news for many weeks, if not months, has been Russia and Ukraine. Geopolitical risks are driving markets. And so we are all looking forward to a riveting and a highly topical discussion. Jacina, over to you to introduce this session and our renowned speaker.
Thank you so much, Louise. And yes, a really warm welcome to my speaker, John Halsman. His bio is, of course, on the website, but let me say that John really is the expert on geopolitical risk, but from a pragmatic point of view, and that's what I really love. When I was looking at how many speeches and engagements he's done, it's phenomenal. I think you're called by every single government and every single company in the world, it seems to me. But not only that, I was really impressed, John, by the variety of topics you address in your books. And, just to quote a few, you look at sort of a paradigm for the New World Order, but also you take a look at Lawrence of Arabia, one of my favorite heroes, flawed hero, but a hero nonetheless. You have done a foreign policy parable through the Godfather Doctrine, and I love that. I mean, that is really phenomenal. And of course, you are now also in a podcast. So those of you who love podcasts like I do listen to him. Again, John, that we have so many topics to discuss. 25 minutes is too little. And I would say to the organizers, please, next time, give us more time, because we have so many topics. And as we're speaking, the topics might be changing, who knows, but we will not address that because we're not looking at the news while we're speaking. I would say, let's start with the biggest topic of all today. We have the tensions in Asia, China and Russia aligning to form a pincer movement, it seems, and ever closely chumming together. This is a problem for the US. It's a problem for Europe. We shouldn't underestimate Putin. And you did a recent podcast on Putin, and you said you have to look at Putin from his eyes, his perspective. We tend to look at it from our own perspective, and so we don't see his reality. And I thought that really caught me. And I think you have to see that for Putin, the collapse of the Soviet Union was the biggest defining moment in his life. And that, I think, we're totally underestimating. I would say as well, it really is important to understand, his sensitivity, watching that Soviet Union disintegrate as he was a young KGB officer, and his emotional determination to bring that Soviet Union. And I say emotional because you also said he's not emotional, but he is emotional about that point. John, let's hear some of your takeaways on all of this.
Well, Jacina, it's great to be here with you, and I've enjoyed our talking before all this. The reality about Putin is, yes, one of the big mistakes people make is to say, what would I do if I were in Castro's shoes or Putin's shoes? And that's not the question. What we would do would be to liberalize the free press, call in McKinsey, do a free market reforms immediately, but that's not the point. It's what would Putin do if he's in Putin's shoes? What does his biography lead to? And Putin, as you say, an icy cold man. I mean, he has a Bonneville and he has form. One of the things that Putin is emotional about and makes a point of saying all the time is that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest catastrophe geostrategically of his time and the biggest tragedy of his life. At the time, he was an up-and-coming KGB officer in East Germany. He thought that he was devoted to this cause, and then it all went away. And everything since has been an effort to make Russia great again, and particularly in line with Peter the Great, to be a strong reformist czar, to restore order to Russia, not to let the oligarchs run wild, but to control that system, and to give Russia strategic depth again. And here we get to Ukraine. To give it depth, Russian geostrategy has followed a playbook since the 18th century that's worked very well. When Sweden invaded in the 18th century, Napoleon invades in the 19th, and the Kaiser and Hitler invade in the 20th, you trade this land for time. Winter comes on and decimates the army that you're dealing with. It's been a remarkably successful playbook. With Russia on its knees, as NATO has advanced toward Russia's borders, they've lost this depth. Putin thinks you can't be a great power without it. So he does things in the Balkans, he does things in Belarus, he does things in Ukraine, and he does things in the Caucasus in the Middle East to try to restore this depth to make Russia a great power again. He knows it can't be a superpower anymore, but he also knows that if he does this, he's brought it back to great power status, and that's what's driving the man.
John, before I go on, I have one of our listeners and viewers is asking what the title of your podcast is.
Boringly enough, the Spotify title is the John Halsman Podcast, but thank you for asking. You can't miss it. And we just did the one on Putin, and today we've done one on Europe's response to Ukraine. And I love doing them. They're a great way to get out with people.
Thank you, John. I want to quote Putin in follow-up to what you just said. He said, "Whoever does not miss the Soviet Union has no heart. Whoever wants it back has no brain." So I think that's quite a clear indication that he does recognize the almost impossible task. With that same heartfelt, he is determined to go on in whatever way he can. We've said we shouldn't underestimate him. You've told us through his history, the challenges. Tell us a little bit about the China and Russia alliance and how this is going to pan out for Europe and the US.
Well, if you think about it simply enough, the reality is that the only thing that really matters is the superpowers and the great powers beneath them. And the superpowers are the United States and China. And the great powers beneath them involve the Anglosphere countries, the English-speaking countries, the EU, Japan, India, and Russia. And the only play on the board that changes American dominance, literally the only chess play that's foreseeable that really messes with that, is Russia and China forming a real alliance. Now, there are problems with that. One of the problems with this is that Russia doesn't want to be Robin to Xi Jinping's Batman. We call this the Batman problem in the office, because somebody's got to be the dominant power. And great Russian nationalism doesn't lend itself to being Robin. It lends itself to being Batman. And this, of course, caused the break between the Soviets and the Chinese under Mao. He didn't want to be Robin to Khrushchev. And so this is a real problem for Putin. Also, they have real problems in Central Asia where they're competitors, and even Siberia, where China has all the economic wherewithal, but they're competitors. And so this is all on the negative side, but they definitely see that this alliance and making it work is the only way to change the American-dominated order, which they both hate. And that's why they're cuddling at the Olympics, because immediately people worry, is this going to be a firm alliance? They're a long way from there, but they're drifting in that direction without a doubt. And this, every business ought to watch, because this would change the parameters of the world entirely.
And John, one blog I read by a political commentator mentioned that we are in gangster territory. So the gangs, in brackets, the gangs are sort of circling each other, and saying, show me your guns, show me your power. Would you agree with that situation? Are we at that stage?
I think in the sense that they're established powers, the United States, the EU, Japan, and even India wants to join that alliance of established powers. And then they're revisionist powers. They're powers that don't like that order, that want to create a new order, that don't feel that their needs are fulfilled through the old order. And they are eager to upend that order. The problem is they've got to look at each other across the room and see if they can trust each other. That's a giant if. And neither are ready to do that yet. But as these things go on, one of the things that Western policymakers need to be clear of is we don't want to push them into each other's arms necessarily. That would be a catastrophe because the world we live in, we like. We like the world that we live in now. The only problem is if that world is upended. So anything that pushes them together, we should try not to do. And anything that keeps them apart, for instance, when I go to meetings, I whisper the word Siberia in Russians' ears because immediately they know the Chinese are moving on them. And anything I can do to keep them apart, you bet I'm going to do.
Well, one of the interesting things, of course, is that following this close Chinese-Russian friendship, troops have been moving away from the Russian-Chinese border and moving into more too close to the Ukraine. So I think that is an issue. But also, what about sanctions? They can be destabilizing. Are we going about it the right way? Are the economic sanctions the right way? We see also signs that the new Russia-China alliance might be helping each other in these economic sanctions. What are the things that governments could do that might be really effective if this close friendship is to be addressed?
Well, you're right. I mean, they've learned actually, oddly enough, from the Iran decisions of Donald Trump, where there was Donald Trump, in effect, cut off the Iranians from the economy and did a very good job of it through the swift transfer system of the dollar, the dominance of the dollar. And this meant that Iran was effectively excluded from the world economy. The only thing that helped it was a new alliance with, you guessed it, China. And so the Chinese quietly, without offending anybody, kept trading with Iran in violation of all the UN things going on, but quietly went along doing this and gave Iran an outlet both to sell its oil to someone. China desperately needs the oil. Iran desperately needs to sell it. So that's an easy match. But to also sign a 30-year treaty, a strategic treaty, again, ill-defined, not worked through yet, but a drift toward China. And so this is a good day's work for the Chinese. I mean, this is a very good day's work, and it helped them get around this dollar dependency by allowing them to trade in various other manner. And Russia and China are certainly talking about that to get around sanctions, if indeed they are placed on them through the SWIFT system, as has been mentioned. Though, frankly, there are people even in Europe who see this and say it's not worth doing, including the head of the CDU, who's, Mr. Meritz is no dove. I know him rather well, and he's no dove, but he said this will be self-defeating. So could we even get everyone on board? Because sanctions only work when everyone's on board in a globally interdependent world. So China is a big player in quietly organizing these other groups to limit the danger of sanctions. And so we're going to have to think more strategically about driving them apart, looking what's dividing them, seeing where we can work with one another to keep them divided. In other words, we're back to great power politics, which has never really gone away, but the world has woken up to its reality again.
Yes, and I think we can look through history when we're back in these kind of instances. I thank you. There's so many questions already in the Q&A box, and thank you, because I forgot to tell my audience that you can post in there. I was going to take most of them at the end, but I'm going to interject one here for you, John, which is from Thomas. How would tougher sanctions on Russia impact companies like Gazprom and Rosneft?
Well, and that's Thomas, that's a great question. Would they be hurt by this? And yes, they indeed would be. I mean, that's not really the problem. The problem is that so would Germany, for instance, which gets over a third of its natural gas from Russia. So yes, this would hurt Gazprom in the short to even medium term, because as you know, Thomas, you can't just move natural gas around magically and flick a switch and say, gee, now I'm going to trade elsewhere. The United States has found this out recently by talking to Qatar about trying to redivert gas to Europe if it needs it. And there are all kinds of problems with that. There are long-term contracts that are in place about gas that would have to be abrogated, which is no easy feat, either practically, legally, or geostrategically. That's not easy to do. And so Rosneft and Gazprom would be very badly hurt. But so would Europe. And with gas prices rising, I shudder at my gas bill here in Italy. I live in Milan. I shudder with it coming. Governments also have to see how much pain are you willing to endure. And the Russian people are known for dealing with almost limitless pain. Will Europe hold up as well under this situation, or will there be political ramifications? Because Europe has to have regular elections. And would this be reflected if inflation shot through the sky because we didn't deal with this and sanctions actually backfired? These are the calculations we should be making now. But yes, Rosneft and Gazprom would be badly affected, but so would a lot of people in Western Europe.
Yeah, and I think, of course, in Germany, we have a new chancellor. We have 40% dependence of gas on Russia. We have an ex-chancellor in the board of Gazprom. We can ask ourselves questions, how strict is Germany going to be? Macron has elections coming up. So again, challenge for him. You rightly say this. And I think, this has to be tempered. And I think for investors is to watch closely the political temperance with the need to act. Let me take you to the supply chain issues, because of course, COVID was the start of seeing this huge disruption in supply chain. Geopolitics is affecting it hugely as well. John, what advice can you give companies? What advice can you give governments in order to manage? We can't be a fortress, but we can't perhaps be as global as we wanted to be.
Justine, that's exactly the right question. And really the output, if businesses ask me, what's the output of the rising tension in the Sino-American Cold War? It's this, that for 20 years, without anybody saying anything, there was a basic political risk bet made, which is that we're going to have one global supply chain, that we're going to do just-in-time manufacturing, that we're all going to be integrated in the quickest way, the most economically rational way possible, that this is what really matters going forward. And the political risk question, never asked, always implied, but very much there. The political risk question is, for all the problems between the United States and China, they will get their act together. These political and geostrategic problems are secondary to the economic gains that both of them made. And for 20 years, this has been absolutely the case. Now the world is changing. Now this is not true. Now people in America say, I'm worried that all the masks in the world are made in China. I'm worried that all the rare earths in the world come from China. I'm worried that we're utterly dependent on China for manufacturing. And you can indeed alleviate that problem. And it's not that this global supply chain will go away, but there'll be hedging. There'll be onshoring. There'll be a lot more regionalization. Look for winners in this to be people like Canada and Mexico for the United States, where we can deal with the political risk far more easily. There will be a global supply chain, but also hedging. Onshoring, regionalization, things will cost more, there'll be more inflation, and this manufacturing just in time will be less and less a thing of reality because there'll be these competing supply chains. And that's because geopolitics is no longer the ugly stepsister, but is now at the ball with Cinderella. Now geopolitics also matters. And for 20 years, it was a secondary concern to economic gains. I don't think that's true anymore.
Yes, and I think there are quite a lot of questions about this. I think I will take one. There's one from William on the fact that he's declined to invest in a tantalum and cobalt mine in Russia because of ESG, despite the excellent returns. He asked you if he was right.
Well, I mean, it depends on what you want. And I say that that's a key thing for businesses. What are your priorities? And the problem with government where I've worked and business where I now work is that priorities tend to become a laundry list. And that's not a priority. That's not making a choice. The problem is, what are you really trying to do? Are you there to maximize economic gain in every case, which is at an extreme and amoral position? But at the other extreme, you're only there to do good, meaning you're a philanthropy. That isn't likely to work for business. You have to function somewhere in the middle. And the key is to clearly articulate what it is you're trying to do and then stick with that and look at that. For instance, in what I do, I'm a realist. I'm a Jeffersonian. I know exactly what I am and where I'm coming from. And this allows me to address foreign policy questions issue by issue because I have that format and that framework laid out. I've spent 20 years thinking about it. Now I apply it. And as you say, Justina, that's the key to being good at political risk. Can you apply it? And I think the same is true for business.
Thank you, John. I'm looking here. I will take one other question because we will close the Russia-China chapter after and move on to inflation. So one from Timothy. Many observers draw parallels between potential Russian threat to Ukraine and China's desire to absorb Taiwan. Do you think these are parallel and have they connection to each other?
They do, and it scares me that they do. It's a very good question because the United States has not clearly articulated its priorities. And the priority of the United States is the Indo-Pacific. In my political risk firm, it's the Indo-Pacific. All the risk and all the reward are located in the same area. And the United States, I think, would come to the defense of Taiwan if it were forced to in the next couple years. And I don't think the Chinese believe that they would because the United States left Afghanistan and will not intervene militarily in Ukraine. That's true, but they're not the same situation. The United States has interests, primary, secondary, and tertiary. And it's not articulating, neither Trump nor Biden, so it's a bipartisan comment, are articulating what are the things that matter to the United States that it's willing to expend blood and treasure for, what are the things that would like to happen, and what are the things that don't really matter, but on a good day it would favor. Afghanistan was never a priority other than dealing with Al Qaeda. So that's easy to give up. That doesn't show American weakness. That shows America pivoting to Asia and what matters. Ukraine, although important, is a secondary interest. It's not a member of NATO. The United States has no treaty obligation, doesn't trade with Ukraine, and couldn't defend Ukraine if it wanted to. So that isn't the same. The problem is that the Chinese can misread this restraint as American weakness because the Americans are not clearly articulating what their interests are. So the link is this could lead to a terrible miscalculation. And it's up to the United States to very clearly articulate its interests. It's getting better at doing it. It's saying, for instance, in the National Security Decision Directive, that great power competition is back, that China is the primary threat in the future to the United States, that Asia is the future for the United States. It's getting better, but the president needs to articulate this much more clearly.
I think that your last comment puts it exactly right. I think we are in an age of instant communication. We're in an age where there's misinterpretation very quick. So politicians need to be absolutely clear and without any sort of double jointedness, let's say, because it is so easily misinterpreted. I'm afraid we're going to have to close the Russia chapter, although we might be coming back to it. We have so many interesting things, and I want to pick your brain on so many issues. Let's go to the rise of endemic inflation. Now, John, when we were prepping this call, you mentioned a wonderful time, and it spoke to me so much. So I will share it with the viewers. You once spent a whole day in a ski hut with Paul Volcker. And you had some cigars. I don't know if you did. I think you did have some cigars, and you drank some cognac, reflecting on the world. Now, think back to that time when you spent that whole day brainstorming with Paul Volcker. Where if you were having that conversation today, what would the outcome be?
Well, as you say, I mean, immediately after that call, Justina, I called my father and said, grad school was really worth it. You won't believe what I just did today. I spent the day talking to Paul Volcker, having these beautiful meals in Switzerland, snowed in, and talking about the nature of the world. And Volcker told me a very interesting story. When I said, how did you destroy inflation, which of course was endemic in the 70s with stagflation, even worse, no growth, high inflation. He said, I was very lucky to have Ronald Reagan. And I said to him, Mr. President, I can kill the beast of inflation, which was at 13% dead, but I'm going to have to raise interest rates to 19%, and they'll be the worst recession since the Great Depression. It will certainly cost you the midterms. It might cost you the next election. And Reagan, in his amiable, underrated way, patted Volcker on the hand and said, Paul, you leave the politics to me. You deal with inflation, and I'll deal with the fallout. And Volcker and I then toasted Reagan. What a great thing to do. And for 40 years, we've had no inflation to speak of. And none of us remember, or I certainly don't, a time with real inflation. I remember my father grumbling a little about gas prices, and that was it. Now they've taken their eye off the ball, central banks, and I understand why. I think it's human that they didn't know how bad COVID would be and how much damage would be done to the economy in the long term. Better to err on the side of caution. So they shovel money at the problem. We go to Keynesian stimulus under both Trump and Biden. No difference at all. And as Larry Summers said, you've increased federal spending by 14 to 15%. What they got wrong was the economy bounces back and is now to pre-COVID levels almost immediately. So if you add 14% of spending, you will get inflation. It's math. And Volcker would now say the beast of inflation is loose. And so you have every central bank in the world scrambling, knowing this, scrambling to contain the fact that Frankenstein's monster is out, and not wanting to scare the villagers, to keep the analogy going. And so now they have a blunt tool, which is interest rates. They know they have to raise them, but if they undershoot raising them, they're just going to fuel more inflation. And if they overshoot, they're going to have a recession. And so this is tremendously tricky time. This is a time for what Gordon Brown used to boringly but correctly talk about, that we need to coordinate this across the Western world. This is the time that they need to talk together and come up with a composite plan. It would make investors happy. It would show that they know what they're doing, and it would show that they see the problem and are dealing with it. The signaling effect of this would be wonderful. And I think that's what Volcker would say, what he was very good at. I will destroy inflation. The politics are Reagan's problem. Reagan said he's right. Don't vote for me, but don't blame the Fed. We need this kind of approach of the Bank of Japan, the ECB, and the Fed to come together and work out a common policy with the Bank of England. And if this happens, I think we'll be in good shape. But they are now hitting a moving target. And now that the beast is loose, it's very, very difficult. I'm delighted to say my firm called this early on when there was a huge controversy. Is Larry Summers right, or is Paul Krugman right? Summers, I think, is one hands down. Good Clinton, New Democrat, has gotten this right. And I think now we have to be clear that we're going to hit a moving target, but the way to do it is to do it together.
I think in the EU, things are complicated for Christine Lagarde, right? What do you see unfolding in the EU? Because the signs are mixed. We have strong house prices raising 10% in the last year, but still, Christine Lagarde, in her last speech on the 14th of January, was quite cautious about saying how she would deal with inflation. Where do you see this going in the EU?
Well, I think Madame Lagarde is right to play for time. Yeah, I think you do two things. You realize, as you say, it's much harder for the EU because you have different economies always. There hasn't been monetary union in the same way there is in the United States or even Japan, where the differences in economic viability between Mississippi and New York are real, but that ultimately everyone has accepted for a very long time that there's going to be one interest rate. The problem now is Italy is not in the same place as Germany, is not in the same place as France. And this, of course, is a massive headache for Madame Lagarde. So on one hand, she doesn't want to stifle the growth rates in Southern Europe, which desperately need the catch-up growth. On the other hand, she doesn't want to lower interest rates and lead to inflation in Germany, which of course Germans are neuralgic about given history. And so she's got to thread that needle at the same time she tries to coordinate with the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England, and the Fed. I think she has by far the most daunting job for that reason of anyone. And so I think there are times to say nothing and there are times to talk clearly. Right now is a time to say nothing until you line up your shot, and then you're decisive and definitive. But I think you'll see the ECB raise rates at a slower pace than the United States for a couple reasons. Inflation in America is farther advanced. America's already come out of COVID in the cycle, is ahead in the cycle in terms of both growth and inflation. So raising interest rates at a quicker rate makes perfect sense. Europe is just coming out of it, so you'd be more cautious, err on the side of letting inflation go up a little bit more even, but you can't let the monster escape fully and get down to the village. So I would look for the EU to raise them at a slower rate, but to try to coordinate this, but being always on guard that her place in the cycle is a different spot than the Americans or indeed the Japanese or even the British.
Jean-Claude Trichet was a master at the art of saying something without saying something. I think Christine Lagarde has come very close, is coming very close to him. I'm going to take a question here from Christopher. How do you factor in the easing of QE and switch to QT alongside central bank coordination on interest rates?
This is a great question, and the answer is with difficulty. It's not clear how fast they're going to do and how much that takes, but that in effect is almost another form of an interest rate. Yes, and I think the Americans are moving out of QE very, very quickly. I think the rest of the stimulus packages in the rest of the world, Japan, Bank of England, ECB, will be slower. And again, that's fine. It's coordinating them. We've got to get away from the notion that there is a one size fits all approach to either QE or interest rates. There's not. We're not in the same place in the cycle. And the danger is, I think, for the Americans to go too slowly because of the rest of the world. And then inflation really does ramp up to double digits. And that would be a political calamity, but more a social calamity, because in essence, inflation is a tax on the working poor. And of 10, 11, 12%. So I think that's the danger there. The danger in Europe is that if you raise them too fast, you shut off the economic recovery that is necessary coming out of COVID to really get to where you need. I mean, Britain isn't still caught up, for instance, with where it was economically pre-COVID in the way the United States is. And so this all has to be factored in a variegated way. It is not a one-size-fits-all policy. And that has to be communicated clearly. And so far, I've not seen anything. And QE, of course, plays into that. I mean, it's the flip side of that coin.
John, I think it absolutely, it's not a one size fits all, even while we are seeking to coordinate. At CFA Institute, we did a global COVID survey. Actually, we did it twice, once in March 2020 and once a year later. And our members saw this duality in saying, even within the EU itself, some are saying, well, governments ought to keep on easing, and others are saying, no, we ought to go back into a stricter framework, which reflects what the EU is and how difficult that EU recovery plan is, even within the very tight frame. I mean, I've been seeing at close quarters with some of our CFA societies around the EU who are helping ministries of finance in the EU recovery plan, how complicated it is to stimulate companies to come back to pre-pandemic levels. Any advice for this EU recovery that you can impart to us and maybe help our EU societies as well when they advise?
Well, Jacina, we talked about this before. I mean, I think, again, clear signaling. Again, it's going to be different. It's not wise fits all. Start with broad brush strokes, and then you devolve down to the local level where you get to the micro company, regional, countrywide level. And there'll be differences in Europe within that. This is a strength of Europe. I love that Europe it's the heterogeny that you can go 100 miles and be in 1,000-year-old different civilization. That's why I've lived here very happily for 2/3 of my working life. That is a strength, this difference, this laboratory for trying things out, see what works, see what doesn't. I mean, this is a wonderful advantage, but clear signaling is vital that we're not going to go at the same rate as the Americans because they're ahead in the cycle, or the British now, that we're going to look internally, that we want to come online as fast as possible given COVID limitations, but this is vital that we do so, but that we have a coordinated plan. Of course, interest rates will have to go up, but growth, because European growth levels for the last 20 years have been lagging behind. I mean, Italy is just now has the GDP where I live that it did when it entered the euro, and that's politically disastrous. We have to show that the project is economically vibrant, and if that's the case, all these other problems can be dealt with. If that's not the case, and it's seen in a broad brush way as a failure, then there's huge political risk ahead.
Yeah, and now we come to the last part of our conversation, which is really, the validity of politics as we stand at the moment. We have Brexit, which has really caused a huge impact, not only on the EU, but I would say on the EMEA region and indeed globally. Repositioning of one of the biggest financial markets outside what was traditionally the core in the EU. A divergence also in foreign policy, a closer perhaps joint approach to the UK, to the US. But again, when we look at Brexit inside the UK, the rise of populism, the rise of politicians that, and in your words, behave like Marie Antoinette. And I do love that article. Again, for those of viewers, great article, February 11th for Arab News on Boris Johnson and Marie Antoinette, comparing the situation in the UK actually on the party scandal and to Marie Antoinette's let them eat cake when the population was starving. John, I do love this analogy, so forgive me for bringing it up, but it is really great. What is your take on this?
Well, I mean, I wrote a piece that I think is interesting about political risk. If we look at Europe and the United States, and Bill Clinton used to say this, I knew him a little, and he used to say, you know, the problem for me is that, and Bill Clinton was the best political mind of anybody I've met, certainly of his generation. There's a reason that the Secret Service code name for Bill Clinton was Secretariat, the great Triple Crown winning horse. And he wasn't natural, but he used to complain that the Democrats and the center left in Europe and the United States are seen as the mommy party. They're nurturing, they're kind, everyone likes them. But the center right are seen as the daddy party. They're tough. They're saying, study harder, eat your vegetables, do better at school. And while not everyone always likes them, they're glad for them. And that this gave the Republicans and the center right a great advantage. And if you look since from the Cold War to now, the dominant parties in much of Europe have been on the center right. The CDU in Germany has been dominant, the Gaullists in France, the Tory party in England, and the Republican Party since, say, around the time of Eisenhower has held the presidency more often than not because they had a simple brand. We will be economically sensible. Eisenhower actually balanced the budget remarkably 4 out of 8 years. Doesn't that sound great? We will be realist and tough, but internationalist. We'll work with each other, but we will be tough strategically, and we will be politically moderate. We will stop the far right from gaining traction. And indeed, Franz Josef Strauss, the former head of the CSU, said the great thing about the CSU, the reason for its existence is everything to our right is not acceptable. That we are the vanguard that keep politics within an acceptable parameter of discourse. And this worked for a very long time, but obviously now this has fallen away. This has fallen away in the United States, where Trump spent money like a drunken sailor, certainly was no political moderate. I say this as a Republican, a heartbroken one, but a Republican. And even on foreign policy had odd ideas. We see in Britain, where Boris Johnson has moved back to the center and away from kind of Thatcherite politics. Let's spend money and keep people happy. Where he's, again, certainly no moderate. We see the Gaullist party doing very poorly in presidential elections. Pécresse has fallen behind again. Le Pen and is about even with Zemmour, with Macron way ahead, who has no party. And we see the CDU have its worst election result in history. So the grown-ups, the old daddy party across the board is no longer what it once was, and that brand has been tainted. So the goal now is for the rest of us who are in the kind of moderate center that used to run the countries of the West to find a way to work together again and reanimate this brand, which is really broken down. I could pick on the center left as well, but I have to say the center right, because it's been dominant, is an easier and more useful target.
Thank you, John. Of course, I'm going to raise one question for you within the whole within European politics. I know, and I'm Dutch. In Holland, we like our polder model, which is collaboration with about 8 political parties, building consensus, seemingly impossible. But it worked up to recently. Recent times have shown that that doesn't work either. Any thoughts on this polder model perhaps being useful elsewhere, or is this also part of something that needs to be revisited?
Well, I think we have to rediscover the Polder model, Justina. I lived in The Hague for a while and worked with the Dutch government at quite intensively. And the joke there among the various ministers was that the real election starts after the election, that it's the negotiation over the coalition that's the real point. And yet, amazingly, these huge electorates and these governments of 4, 6, 8 parties would form together. And I think that way it's about addition and not subtraction, that's a way to look at risk for businesses. If governments are saying, we don't have to agree about everything, but we have to stop calling each other names. We have to go to the lowest common denominator, see what we do agree about, and build on that, which is how the Polder model worked. What do we agree on out there? What do we agree on about Russia and China and trade and monetary policy and investment? And if we start that way, if you see leaders of any stripe who start that way and build by addition and not subtraction, we're going to do an awful lot better. And frankly, anybody who would do that, I would say political risk for that person looks very good. If we continue to divide one another, it can win you elections, as we've seen, but absolutely nothing gets done. And the danger right now for the West is if the model becomes synonymous with nothing getting done. That's not what Xi Jinping and Putin are saying. I can get things done in a dictatorship. It's brutal. It's not fun, but it's a way to move forward. If democracy doesn't deliver the goods, nobody's going to want to be a Democrat, or many people won't. It's time we go back to adding and not subtracting. It's time we go back to lowest common denominators within countries and not. I used to work with the Democrats all the time in Washington when I worked there. We'd make jokes about where we disagreed, but we agreed on strategic matters 80% of the time. And when we spoke with one voice, you could see the difference in how people reacted to us. It's that bipartisan Eisenhower-Truman link that won the Cold War. And we need to go back to that all over the West.
And I would bring up here the Edelman Trust survey that they do every year. This year threw up that for the majority, those that were surveyed placed their trust, instead of in governments, in companies. And I think that is an interesting shift. So no longer looking to governments for that democratic validity. And I'm going to pick on a question from Axel here. Many a technology giant is actively or covertly trying to undermine the power of nation states. Do you expect a new geopolitical crisis as a consequence of new techno power bloc, or will they ultimately always succumb to the military might of major nation states?
That's a great question. And my answer sounds mealy-mouthed, but it's accurate. It'll be somewhere in the middle. This is a new player on the board, the techno giants. There's absolutely no doubt about it, particularly in the United States. But one has to also look at the fact, and it isn't just military power, it's fear of regulation, frankly. And they know that if they go too far and challenge governmental power too overtly in the United States, the Democrats have absolutely no problem with regulating anybody. They're Democrats. That's what they like to do. And so there's always behind them, the sword of Damocles is always hanging over the head of the techno giants. Yes, they can run with the ball. Yes, they're another source of power out there that matter, and we need to think an awful lot more about. But no, they'll never supplant nation states because they can always be regulated. And as Axel rightly said, there's always military power, but they can always be regulated. For instance, is Facebook a platform? Is Facebook a newspaper? How does that exactly work? If it's a newspaper, it can be regulated. If it's a platform, it cannot be. All they have to do is stray too far and challenge governments, and you watch these things be regulated. Techno giants and the lobbyists that work with them know this, and so this will always restrain them from overtly challenging. But covertly, certainly they're now another pole of power. Axel's right, and we have guys at my firm who spend an awful lot of time thinking through that because they're another player on the chessboard. They're not the queen, but they're certainly a bishop or a castle and can do an awful lot.
I love it. Not a queen but a bishop, and they can do a lot. John, and I'm so sorry that we have so little time because there's still so many questions. I'm going to ask you one question, but you have to really be very, 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 very short. And it's about the COVID pandemic. Has the COVID pandemic changed geopolitical rankings, or will all countries revert back to their pre-pandemic positions?
I think it's changed them in that it's exacerbated the superpower contest that was brewing between the United States and China. It's now at a much further state. But I think that really the great power list I would have and the superpower list, that hasn't changed. But it's sharpened these divisions. And again, it's made geopolitics far more important for the new era than it was before. It's not an economics first world. It's now a mix, and geopolitics is now something that has to be considered by businesses in every single thing they do.
Thank you. John, I'm going to quote Winston Churchill at you. I love quoting him. A pessimist sees the difficulty in every opportunity. An optimist sees the opportunity in every difficulty. I think that about sums up our chat today. Thank you so much. I look forward to engaging with you further. I'm sure the audience does too, through your podcast, your many articles, and your books, I would recommend. We will be taking a 5-minute break and then come back for the closing session of the Alpha Summit EMEA, when I will be moderating a session on the resilience of capital markets. Thank you very much, John. It was really a pleasure. Thank you.
Great pleasure, Jacina. Enjoyed it.
Thank you.